The influence that LeBron has on his team's rosters is so well known that he's earned the nickname Le GM. And while I think most people who are saying this are saying it in a negative way, like trying to imply that if the team around him isn't good enough, it's his fault, I do think it's an interesting question to ask ourselves. Is this influence that he has a good thing or a bad thing? Today, I'm trying to answer that question. Now, I think his influence really started to take hold later in his career, mostly his second stint with the Cavs and his stint with the Lakers. When he was first on Cleveland, he definitely was trying to bring stars in, but he didn't have the decision-making power it seems like that he does now. And when he was with the Heat, I mean, he certainly orchestrated him and Bosh and Wade all getting together to some level, but Pat Riley was definitely running the show there. So I'm going to start this video looking at the 2014 offseason on. We pick up with LeBron deciding to leave Miami and rejoin Cleveland, and the roster that he finds surrounding himself is a pretty young one. They had been struggling, been one of the worst teams in the league since he had left back in 2010, but after winning the lottery several times and hitting on a couple of big picks, they were starting to put together a pretty good young core. Obviously, you had Kyrie, who at this point was a multiple-time All-Star and ready to plug and play on a contending team as a guy who can go out, generate offense, and get his own shot. But you also had Andrew Wiggins, who was not only a first overall pick, but like a particularly highly touted first overall guy. There was Tristan Thompson as well, who maybe wasn't a superstar or anything, but had turned into a really reliable Iron Man double-double machine inside. And you had Dion Waiters to top it off, who had started to receive some Sixth Man of the Year hype and maybe seemed like he could develop into somebody who would lead second units. So in the event that LeBron didn't join him, I feel like they had a little something going regardless, even if it did take 3 first overall picks to make it happen. But LeBron did join them, and when LeBron joins you, you're not going to sit around and wait to develop these guys and build for a championship timeline that might be far in the future. Instead, you're going to be aggressive and you're going to attempt to mold the roster into one that is ready to compete right now. And that's exactly what they did. Now, they didn't move off of every young player that they had, but there was 2 major trades they made, first during the offseason and then during the middle of the season, that really shifted what this roster was. The first of which being sending Wiggins to the Timberwolves in exchange for Kevin Love. Love had wanted out of Minnesota for a while at this point. While he was there, they weren't a very competitive team. So when LeBron got to Cleveland, he got on the phones, got Love to a more competitive team, and gave Minnesota in return a nice building block to start a new rebuild with. The other move that they made, and this was during the season, is moving Dion Waiters in exchange for J.R. Smith and Amon Shumpert. Not as major as the Love trade, but still moving off of a young promising guy for a couple of role players that are more equipped to help the team win right now. Those 2 moves are really aggressive. It took the Cavs from being, again, a team that was in rebuild mode, thinking about the far future, to a team that was trying to win right now, this season. Now, in retrospect, we can look back on them and say, it was probably the right call. In fact, it was definitely the right call. The young pieces that they ended up trading away, Cleveland, didn't end up panning out quite as well as you'd hope. Dion Waiters never really got efficient enough to be the type of second unit leader that you'd want, and Andrew Wiggins also struggled with efficiency for a large part of his career and wasn't ready to play winning basketball on a great team until far, far into the future. He did get there eventually, give him credit. He was arguably the second best player, or at least the second option, on a championship Warriors team in 2022, but that would have been a long wait for the Cavs, and even then, he didn't really reach his pre-draft hype. Immediately after those moves, the Cavs turned into one of the top 2 contenders in the NBA. And in that sense, it was a success, but when we look back on it, we do kind of feel like maybe they missed their number of rings they could have gotten expectations from the run and the roster that they had. In 2015, they made it to the finals, but with Kevin Love out and Kyrie only playing 1 game, they were pretty easily outmanned by a young Warriors squad. It's tough to win the finals when you have any of your major pieces out. It's pretty rare when it happens, so to have 2 of your top 3 guys out makes it nearly impossible. And give them credit, in 2016, they rebounded, they were healthy, they went up against a 73-win Warriors team, they got down 3-1, and you know what happens. They came back, and they got their first championship. But after that, as we all know, the Warriors then turn around and add Kevin Durant to what was already a legendarily good team. And this put Cleveland in a really tough spot. Even though they had a mostly similar roster to what they had been successful with before, it wasn't going to need enough. They needed to add even more firepower if they were going to match up against this new Golden State team. And they didn't really do that. Because of that, even though they were able to make the finals, which would be a successful season for 99% of teams, they got gentlemen swept, and it didn't really feel like they were all that close to actually getting a title anymore. Again, if they were going to be competitive, they had to upgrade their roster in a major way. But instead, in the 2017 offseason, Kyrie Irving demanded a trade. There's a lot of theories as to why he did this. Maybe some beef with LeBron. Maybe he was tired of the mentor-pupil relationship. Maybe he just wanted a bigger role. But regardless, if a guy asked out and he doesn't want to be on the team anymore, there's not really much you can do other than try to make a move and rebuild the roster. The issue is that it put the Cavs in an incredibly low leverage situation, and a super awkward one too. Typically when a star asks out of a team, that's just kind of it for the current build. And that team's going to need to go through a rebuild, through a restructure. But Cleveland still had LeBron, so they still needed to be competitive. It's pretty rare to have happen, but you're trying to trade away a star, and you're forced to while no team is forced to trade for Kyrie, so it's tough not to get the worst end of the deal there, right? And the move they end up making is trading for Isaiah Thomas, which on the surface at the time made some sense. IT was undersized, but he had a couple of really good years in seasons past, and he was also a guy who could lead an offense or be a serious number 2 offensive engine next to LeBron. Maybe it's not as perfect as a fit as Kyrie was necessarily, but you only have so many options, and if he could just get healthy and get right and get back to his old self, this could actually work out pretty good. However, IT would never get back to his old self. He had, I believe, a hip problem, and he basically was never the same again, never looked anything close to an all-star for the rest of his career. While I think that sunk the ship for the Cavs no matter what, it wasn't the only move that they made that offseason. They brought in Derrick Rose, who was far past his prime, and Dwayne Wade, who was far past his prime. This created one of the all-time great name rosters for the Cavs. I mean, there's a ton of dudes on there where you're like, wow, that guy was a big name, and that guy was a big name. But it didn't create a very good team. They were only slightly above 500, and mind you, they were attempting to catch a 2018 Warriors team that started the season as minus 187 to win it all. What came next is probably the single most famous LeBron roster nuking ever, where they shipped out Jay Crowder, Derrick Rose, Dwayne Wade, IT, Channing Frye, and the 2018 first for George Hill, Rodney Hood, Jordan Clarkson, and Larry Nance. The shakeup made them marginally better, I think. They were 31-22 before the deadline, and then they were 19-10 after. But the second that IT didn't pan out, again, they were out of serious recovery options. Of course, the Cavs are still able to make the finals with this roster, partially because LeBron has one of his best all-time playoff runs, and partially because the East is unbelievably weak. But they have zero hope of turning that into a win against the Warriors in the finals. Even a 50-point performance in Game 1 isn't enough to get them a W, and after that, they don't see another one. That offseason, LeBron looks around, realizes the team has no path to contending or no path to improving after getting swept in the finals, and decides things are probably done here. I'm probably better off moving on to another team, and that's exactly what he does. He leaves for LA, meaning that the Cavs went from rebuilding to winning a championship to a new rebuild in just 4 years while LeBron was there. I think that illustrates just how aggressive teams are when LeBron is at the helm. What's interesting about this is that LeBron goes to LA partially because he wants to be in Los Angeles, it seems, but partially because it's a better situation than the Cavs, and the circumstances are kind of similar to what they were when he rejoined the Cavs. They're a team that had been going through a rebuild for a while, had been one of the worst teams in the league for a while, but was now starting to gain their footing with a bunch of young players. At the time, they had Lonzo, who was a second overall pick and seriously promising. They had Brandon Ingram, who's a second overall pick and seriously promising, and Kyle Kuzma, who had a really great rookie season. Those guys were considered a group you could seriously build with and turn into a championship-level team, almost just like the Cavs were. And to LeBron's credit, he did try to do this. In 2019, LeBron ran it out with that young core, with Lonzo, Ingram, and Kuzma. It seems like he didn't want to be the guy who was just going to every team and blowing up the roster to make it how he wanted to make it. But they weren't really that good or that healthy. Lonzo was still trying to find his shot that he later would, but at the time wasn't. Brandon Ingram wasn't a super efficient shot creator in that moment. And Kyle Kuzma, who famously got compared to Jason Tatum and an all-time great graphic, didn't really take a step from his rookie season the way that you would have wanted him to. With LeBron missing serious time, they finished at 37-45. And LeBron at this point was well into his 30s. and he had the pull to get another star there. And the Lakers had the assets to trade for another star. And that's exactly what they did. That offseason, definitely orchestrated by LeBron, the Lakers end up trading a massive package of both picks and young players for Anthony Davis. Now, this is far more aggressive than the Cavs were. Yes, they traded Andrew Wiggins, but they got back a ready-made star pretty much 1-for-1. That's really not that crazy. And yes, they traded Dion Waiters, but they got back some serious guys who could contribute right away. Those things are a lot more tame. Here, the Lakers were trading a lot of their picks far into the future, and super high potential young guys like Lonzo and Brandon Ingram. Now, don't get me wrong, Anthony Davis at this point in his career, and still now, is a great player, like a rarely good player. But many people made the point that, yes, Anthony Davis was great, but you can't trade that much for one dude. Those young guys are going to develop into great players, and when they do, the Lakers are going to regret it. This is another time where you can understand where people are coming from. LeBron and Rich Paul pulling the strings on another guy who's represented by Rich Paul, getting a massive trade that goes way far into the future, and if it doesn't work is potentially an all-time disaster. Pulls off this move because he wants to win right now because he gets impatient after one season. You totally see the vision how if you're a Lakers fan and you're nervous that this won't work, you could be upset by it. But what ends up happening? It ends up working great immediately. In 2020, the Lakers win the title. It was, of course, a weird bubble year, so you can plug your ears at anything I'm about to say, but this roster was incredibly good. Their defensive personnel with KCP and Caruso and a younger LeBron and Anthony Davis was amazing. And offensively, they weren't as good, but they were still pretty great when you can give the ball to either LeBron or AD all the time. And not only that, when we look back in retrospect on the trade, none of the young pieces that they gave up ended up being quite as good as you maybe would have hoped. Brandon Ingram has been really great, but he has not reached maybe an all-NBA level status or a surefire great number 2 on a championship team status like you would imagine. And Lonzo, who is also a very good player, has really struggled with injuries that have totally derailed his career. That's not to say that the Lakers didn't pay a heavy price, because the draft picks are the draft picks, and when you give up as many as they did, it severely limits your options on what you're going to do moving forward. But when you look back on that trade, what you don't say is, yeah, if the Lakers had just kept all those guys and just kept using their draft picks to bring in more young talent, they definitely would have won a championship. I think it is far from a guarantee, and honestly, very unlikely that that would have worked out for them. So again, just like with Cleveland, you go to the young roster, you make the moves now to maximize the timeline now. It works, and the potential future that you gave up doesn't seem to have been as fruitful as maybe people imagined. But also like Cleveland, it seems like they kind of underperformed after that first championship. Keep in mind, after 2020, it seemed like the Lakers were going to be top-tier contenders for a while. But in 2021, some injuries would get to them. LeBron and AD both missed major time. They end up as a 7 seed, and things aren't exactly right in the first round of the playoffs. They go up against a very good Suns team, and they don't win. Not a good season, but they were also coming off a very short offseason, where the Heat, who had also made the finals and had just as short of an offseason because of the weird bubble stuff, also struggled mightily, also had big injury problems, also went out in the first round. There's reason to believe that potentially they could have been all right if they had decided to run it back. There was some minor moves, obviously. I don't think they had Danny Green anymore. Howard was gone. I think maybe McGee was gone at this point. But the core guys like KCP and Caruso and Kuzma and LeBron and AD, all of them were still there. Or at least potentially could still be there, assuming that they brought them back and didn't trade them. That offseason, the Lakers seemed to panic, and they traded for Russell Westbrook. This was a move that was definitely orchestrated by LeBron, and I think it's safe to say it was an over-aggressive overreaction to a single bad season. They brought in another star, another guy who could create, a bunch of offense with the ball in his hands, but they shipped out great role players like KCP and Kyle Kuzma and gave up a first-round pick on top of that. I think what they were trying to do is match the firepower of the Big Three Nets, who also had Big Three named stars in Kyrie Irving, KD, and James Harden. But now, looking back on it, we kind of don't view the big 1, 2, 3 stars as quite as important as maybe having a solid team build with good role players around them. This move wasn't just an overpay for an aging Westbrook, it actively made the team worse. And Westbrook was not only an aging star, but he was a guy who was not a great defender, not a great shooter, and hard to fit on a contending team. This alone was enough to really screw up what the Lakers had going. But on top of that, and I would say maybe even more bizarrely than trading for Westbrook, they let Alex Caruso walk. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you like it was LeBron who let Caruso walk, but regardless, they were in a position where I guess things were so expensive and they were so far over the luxury tax that they couldn't pay Caruso $9 million a year over the course of 4 years. It was a disaster to let a defender as good as Caruso walk for as little as he did. If I remember correctly, he was willing to take like a minor pay cut to stay with the Lakers. Like he wanted to be on the team, he wanted to be contending, and the number that they offered was just too low. And that contract for the Bulls that he signed ended up being considered like one of the best contracts in the NBA for many years. So if the Westbrook trade alone didn't mess up the depth of the roster, letting Caruso walk really crushed things for him. This to me is where the Lakers kind of break severely from the second stint Cavs. The Cavs had a star player demand out and they had their competition become one of the greatest teams of all time. There's definitely like a universe where they find a way to win another championship. Maybe they stay together until 2019 and then take advantage of the Warriors' injuries killing them. But the Lakers' wounds here were far more self-inflicted. There was no reason why they had to make a move for Westbrook or had to make another move for a star. They could have kept making moves around the margins and kept their core 5-6 guys together and continued to compete. And you look at the next season, 2022, with the eventual champion Warriors, and you say a 2020 style Lakers team probably can compete with those guys. Maybe not necessarily win, but they could have competed with those guys. The Lakers team that we actually saw had no shot, and it was entirely their fault. A year and a half later, we get to the 2023 deadline. Things are going incredibly poorly, and we're due for another roster blow-up. They're working with an incredibly short amount of assets, just like they were in 2018 when they had to blow up the roster with the Cavs. And this is another time where it seems like LeBron is getting antsy. He knows they have no shot to compete. He wants to see things change. He wants to continue to be aggressive. I think it's fair to say for some of these deadline moves, it might not have been LeBron like saying, hey, I want this guy and this guy and this guy, go get them, in the way that he was for Anthony Davis or Westbrook or Kevin Love. But he certainly was saying, we need to improve here. We need to move off of this guy. We need to change this around. And you've got to be the one to be aggressive and go make those changes. At the deadline, they end up getting off of Russell Westbrook and bringing in D'Angelo Russell, who at least is a little bit better of a shooter, if also kind of an inconsistent guy. They bring in Rui Hachimura for 4 second-round draft picks, which seems like pretty great value. And Jared Vanderbilt as well, who isn't a complete player, isn't really much of an offensive guy, but defensively is good and can be used as sort of a situational, put him in the lineup sometimes when things are just right tool. And this works shockingly well. For context, I mean, the Lakers at the deadline were 25-30. They were the 12 seed. They were out of it even with the play-ins. By the end of the season, they had played themselves into a winning record. They were like 43-39, and they were the 7th seed. And it translated into playoff success. They beat a pretty good Memphis team. They ended up beating the Warriors, although they weren't quite as good as their 2022 version. And they made it all the way to the conference finals, which I would say alone, just looking at that trade deadline, was a major success. But in those conference finals, they were pretty outmatched by a very, very good Nuggets team. They played them very bravely, and I think there's some truth to LeBron's foot at that point bothering them, but the moves that they had made years prior were still costing them. They weren't on the level of that Nuggets team, and they would have been incredibly lucky to get past them at that point. I don't know if I would have said that they fully recovered back into a serious 1A contender that they were, 2 years ago. In 2024, the Lakers are only getting older. Anthony Davis is always dealing with injury problems. Their role players, while improved from the post-Westbrook trade Lakers, still aren't the pre-Westbrook trade Laker level that you need them to be to compete for a title, and they end up getting matched up with the Nuggets in round 1, which is an incredibly bad pull, and they get beat pretty soundly in that one as well. Going into 2025 here, that's about the same situation they're in right now. They just made a move for Dorian Finney-Smith, shipping off D'Angelo Russell. I think that's a solid one. They've also been able to develop Austin Reeves over these few years. They picked him up for very little, obviously, and he's turned into a great player. But we're starting to get to the point where LeBron just turned 40. He's not the almost MVP that he was earlier in his Lakers career. And I think because of that, the Lakers are getting more and more cautious about trading, first-round draft picks to try to win right now, when it seems like they're kind of on the outside looking in as far as contenders go. As I've been working on this video, this may have changed. There's been some reports recently that they're willing to trade the 3 first-round draft picks that they're legally allowed to. So the story might not be over yet, even though I do think they've been more cautious about aggressive moves like that in the last couple of years. Maybe going forward they won't be, and they can add a big-time star. However, the Lakers being more cautious doesn't mean that LeBron didn't have any roster influence over the team last offseason. They did draft his son with the 55th pick. This is obviously really not that important from a team building perspective. It was the 55th overall pick. At the end of the day, you wouldn't expect to get much for a dude like that anyway. And I'll be real with you, I'm a LeBron fan. It was cool to see him play with his son. That's something we've been talking about for years, to actually see it happen, to see LeBron be good enough, long enough to be able to be around when his son turns 19 and is NBA eligible, and his son at least be good enough so where it makes sense to draft him, even if he did have a little bit of nepotism help. It's super dope. But if I wasn't a LeBron fan, and I wasn't interested in seeing that because I thought it would be a cool achievement, yeah, I would roll my eyes at it a little bit. And I think I can't really blame anybody who does. So that's the story of LeBron's influence over basically the last decade. What's the takeaway? Here's what I'll say positively. The aggression that he brings to these teams is a good thing. When you have a 1A star like LeBron, like a serious top 5 player in the world, you should be trying to win right now. This idea that you're going to sit around and develop these young guys would be nice if LeBron was 22, but when he's 30, when he's older, and when you have a chance to compete for a title right now, that's what you should be doing. Windows in the NBA are shorter than people think. People also vastly overestimate how good young prospects are. We look at every young prospect and assume the absolute best for him, but in reality, of all the guys that LeBron tried to trade away, or did trade away, how many of them ended up hitting what people expected them to be? Very few of them, if any at all. When you have a chance to get a player like Anthony Davis and LeBron in your team at the same time, you do it and you trust that you can figure things out. This is all evidenced by the fact that both times that LeBron told his team, hey, we need to be aggressive, hey, we need to get this star, it worked. However, I think it's fair to say that for how good those teams were and for how good LeBron is, it's kind of a shame that each of them only got one ring. In Cleveland, I think particularly bad luck got the best of them. And if they had been healthier in 2015, I think they would have won. Or if the Warriors hadn't signed Kevin Durant, I think they potentially could have gotten another one. Or Kyrie might have decided, hey, I think we have a really good chance to win here again. I'll hold on for at least 2018. That sort of roster aggression or team building aggression extends to him leaving the Cavs after 2018 as well. That was not only the right move for him, but the right move for the Cavs too. Think about how many teams there are in the NBA who are just sort of stuck in this middle ground and they're not truly rebuilding and they're not truly competing and they can't get a great draft pick and they're not really going anywhere. If LeBron had stayed on that Cavs roster, they wouldn't have been able to tank and they wouldn't have been able to seriously compete. By leaving, he allowed them to tank and look where they are now. They're one of the best teams in the NBA again. I don't know if it's going to turn into a finals victory. It's still a little early to say that, but as it stands, they're certainly in a better position now with the team they've got currently than they would be if LeBron had stuck around for even 2 or 3 more years trying to make something work that never was going to. So you can try to frame LeBron leaving teams as him chewing them up and spitting them out. I just entirely disagree with that. I think being aggressive in a rebuild and being aggressive when you're going for a championship is the right play when you're building in the NBA. That's not to say that LeBron's leaving for better teams out of the goodness of his heart, but it is a good thing, and I disagree with the criticism of it. However, I think on the negative side, it's fair to say that you can be too aggressive, and when they brought in Westbrook, that was too aggressive. That was a team that was made a contender by LeBron's influence, and then stopped being a contender because of LeBron's influence. Very potentially, it cost them a ring. I don't know for certain if they would have gotten one. I don't know if there's any year where you're yeah, they for sure would have won it. But man, if they had the 2020 Lakers against the 2023 Nuggets or a team like that when they met up in the Western Conference Finals, I think they would have had a lot better of a shot. On top of that, it's pretty clear that LeBron is, playing favorites with some of his friends or some guys he's buddies with or some guys who have been in the league a long time and have earned his respect. That's why you see James Jones be able to follow him around for a while, or, you see him go get Westbrook or go draft his son, of course. And that stuff isn't always good for the team. Sometimes it is. When you're buddies with Anthony Davis, it's actually great. When you're buddies with aging Derrick Rose, not so much. Like most things, there's some good and some bad. I'd say generally, it's more good than bad. Generally, the aggression is good. Generally, people are too negative about it because they either dislike LeBron or they overvalue how good young players are going to be. But it's certainly not been perfect, and I'm not going to be the guy to sit here and defend every single move that every single LeBron team has ever made. So is Le GM good at his job? I'll say generally, yes. But he also has the advantage of every team that he manages has LeBron on it already. And and that makes things a lot easier. If you enjoyed this video and stuck all the way through it, I'm going to go ahead and say it. You the goat. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, all that good stuff. I'll link all of my other accounts down below again if you want to check those out. And I'll catch y'all next time.